The room hummed with tension as Professor Zyrax's taloned hand slammed onto the metal desk, sending a ripple of silence through the lecture hall. His scaled brow furrowed, black eyes narrowing as they scanned the assembled students. The dim, blue light of the Academy's holoscreens cast jagged shadows across his angular face, making him appear even more imposing. "Your final assignment is simple," he rasped, his voice carrying the weight of authority and condescension. "Capture the Phyrexian shade." Murmurs rippled through the class. Even the more battle-hardened species, the hulking Drathax warriors and the keen-eyed Shirak hunters, exchanged uneasy glances. Jack Carter, the only human in the room, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. Unlike the others, he didn't mutter complaints or trade worried looks. He had learned long ago that reacting was what they wanted. Humans were the outsiders here, and any sign of doubt would only fuel their prejudices. Professor Zyrax's lip curled into something resembling amusement. "Ah, Cadet Carter. I assume you find this task amusing?" His voice was thick with mockery. Jack met his gaze. "Not amusing, sir. Just curious. You said capture. Doesn't that imply it can be caught?" A ripple of laughter skittered through the class, quickly stifled when Zyrax's forked tongue flicked in irritation. "Clever words will not help you when the shade is upon you, human. It has evaded capture for decades. Entire teams of trained operatives have failed where you will undoubtedly fail as well. But this is not merely a test of your skills. It is a test of your worth." The professor paused, then let the next words drip like venom. "Since you seem so eager, Cadet Carter, you will work alone." Jack's jaw tightened, but he refused to give Zyrax the satisfaction of a reaction. Around him, the other students smirked, some shaking their heads in amusement. A lone human against a nightmare? The professor might as well have handed him a death sentence. "The rest of you will be assigned teams. The hunt begins at dawn on Nithros 7. Dismissed." As the students filtered out, Jack felt a presence beside him. He glanced up to see Sari, a sleek Shirak with feline features, studying him. "You should refuse." "That an offer to switch places?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Her ears flicked back in irritation. "I don't pity you, human. I just hate pointless deaths." Jack smirked. "Good thing I don't plan on dying." She scoffed and disappeared into the crowd. Jack sat alone in his quarters, scrolling through the Academy's database on the Phyrexian shade. Most of the information was useless. Heightened reflexes. Adaptive camouflage. Near supernatural evasion abilities. The logs were filled with failed hunts and cryptic reports from those who had barely escaped. Every attempt relied on brute force, advanced traps, or overwhelming firepower. "Idiots," Jack muttered. If the shade had survived all this time, it wasn't by being the strongest. It was by being the smartest. The moment it detected a threat, it vanished into the jungle, using the terrain to its advantage. No one had considered an approach other than attack. No one had tried understanding it. Jack leaned back, thinking. There was a way. There was always a way. He just had to find it before the jungle swallowed him whole. The first rays of dawn stretched across the rugged terrain of Nithros 7 as Jack adjusted his gear. He traveled light, no heavy weapons, no bulky traps. Just a survival knife, a compact scanner, and a pouch of supplies. His approach drew whispers from the other cadets as they suited up in full combat gear, rifles slung across their backs. Drakvar, a towering Drathax, sneered. "You planning to talk it into a cage, human?" Jack slid on his visor, ignoring him. Words wouldn't change their minds. Results would. A harsh beep signaled the start of the hunt. The jungle loomed ahead, a dense labyrinth of bioluminescent flora and shifting shadows. Jack moved deliberately, not rushing like the others who charged ahead with weapons drawn. He had no intention of chasing the shade. That was a losing game. Instead, he observed. The jungle was alive, each rustle and chirp a piece of a larger pattern. The shade would have a rhythm, a way of moving that kept it hidden. Jack needed to find the gaps in that rhythm, the moments where it let its guard down. Hours passed. Reports crackled through his earpiece, failed ambushes, squads turning on one another in frustration. Every attempt was the same: force, force, and more force. And every attempt ended the same way, with nothing. Jack crouched near a shallow stream, running a hand through the cool water. The shade would need water, too. But it wouldn't drink where it could be seen. It would wait, hidden, until it was sure it was alone. He exhaled slowly, letting his body relax. He didn't act like a predator. He made himself small, unthreatening. Then he waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The jungle whispered around him, creatures stirring in the distance. And then, a flicker. A ripple in the air. Jack didn't move. The shade emerged from the undergrowth like a living shadow, its form shifting seamlessly between visibility and invisibility. Its 6 limbs barely made a sound as it approached the water's edge. It was cautious, expecting danger. Jack didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he did something no one else had tried. He whistled. The sound was soft, almost musical. The shade froze, its luminous eyes locking onto him. For the first time, it didn't vanish. It didn't flee. It watched. Jack smiled. "That's right. I see you." A moment stretched between them, fragile as glass. And then, for the first time in recorded history, the Phyrexian shade did not run. The jungle held its breath. Jack remained still, his muscles relaxed but alert. The Phyrexian shade, a creature of legend and fear, regarded him with unblinking, luminous eyes. It wasn't fear that froze the beast, it was curiosity. No one had ever stopped to look, to acknowledge it as anything but a prize or a threat. Jack didn't break the moment. He kept his posture non-threatening, his breathing slow. He whistled again, a low, melodic tone, mimicking the sounds of the jungle around him. The shade's body rippled, its adaptive camouflage flickering in and out of visibility like a mirage. Jack could sense its hesitation, the primal war between instinct and intrigue playing out in the depths of its predatory mind. Then, motion. The shade's claws flexed against the damp earth, but it didn't bolt. It tilted its head, sniffing the air. A test. Jack knew better than to respond with anything sudden. He reached slowly into his pouch, fingers grazing the small satchel of dried rations he'd brought. He wasn't an idiot, he had studied the failed hunts. The shade wasn't drawn to bait, not in the traditional sense. It didn't scavenge, it was an apex predator. But trust was built in steps, and food was as ancient a gesture as any. He placed a small strip of jerky on the moss-covered ground between them, then withdrew his hand. The shade's nostrils flared. Then, a snap. The jungle exploded with noise. A pulse of energy detonated nearby, sending a shockwave through the undergrowth. The shade's head snapped toward the disturbance. Its body blurred, vanishing like mist. Jack swore under his breath and rolled into the shadows, pressing himself against the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. His visor flared to life, tracking movements in the underbrush. A squad of cadets crashed through the foliage, weapons primed. Drakvar, hulking and brimming with confidence, led the charge, his plasma rifle humming as he scanned for movement. Jack clenched his jaw. Idiots. The Phyrexian shade was gone. They had shattered the fragile connection he had been building in a single moment of reckless aggression. Drakvar's voice rang out. "Did you see that?" He gestured wildly at his squad mates. "It was right here." Sari emerged behind him, her feline eyes narrowing as she sniffed the air. "You scared it off, you fool." Drakvar bared his teeth. "You're just mad you didn't get a shot at it first, cat." Jack exhaled slowly before stepping into the clearing. "You're wasting your time." The group whirled toward him, weapons half-raised. Drakvar's lips curled into a sneer. "And you, human, are hunting with nothing but wishes." Jack ignored him. "You won't catch it by stomping through the jungle like a pack of drunken war beasts." He turned toward Sorry, the only one with a shred of common sense. You felt it, didn't you? The way it moves? It's not just fast, it's deliberate. She studied him. Go on. It doesn't run blindly. It anticipates. It reads body language. It knows when it's being hunted. That's why no one's caught it, because the second you become a threat, you're already too late. Drakvar scoffed. And what, you think being its friend will get you closer? Jack shrugged. It's gotten me closer than any of you. Drakvar's expression darkened, but before he could fire back, their comms crackled to life. Cadets, report. The Shade is on the move. It's headed toward the cliffside ruins. Jack stiffened. The ruins. That changed things. The Shade never stayed in open areas, it relied on dense terrain. If it was heading toward the cliffs, it meant one of two things: either it was cornered, or it was leading them into a trap. Jack didn't wait for discussion. He turned and started running. Where the hell do you think you're going? Drakvar shouted after him. Jack didn't answer. If they were lucky, they still had time. If not, well, he'd rather not find out what happened to those who let themselves get lured into a Phyrexian Shade's chosen ground. The air grew thinner as Jack ascended the rocky path toward the ruins. The distant glow of the Academy's orbital beacon flickered faintly above the jungle canopy. His visor pulsed with data, heat signatures, motion readings, atmospheric shifts. The Shade was here. He slowed his pace, steadying his breath. Every step forward had to be intentional. One wrong move, and he'd spook it, or worse, provoke it. The ruins loomed ahead, ancient stone half swallowed by the encroaching jungle. Vines strangled crumbling pillars, and the remnants of an old civilization whispered secrets in the wind. Jack crouched behind a jagged outcrop, scanning the area. The Shade's camouflage was near perfect, but not invincible. It would need to shift, to move, to breathe. There. A ripple, barely perceptible, along the curve of a broken archway. Jack exhaled slowly. It was watching him. He reached up, slowly lifting his visor and pulling it free. A sign of trust. A risk. Then, he did something no hunter had ever done in recorded history. He turned his back on it. Silence. A beat. Then, a whisper of movement. The Shade stepped forward. Jack fought every instinct screaming at him to turn. He could feel its presence just behind him, close enough that he could sense the shift in temperature, the faintest breath of alien air against his skin. Then, something unexpected. A sound. Not a growl. Not a hiss. A low, inquisitive chirp. Jack smiled. That's right. I see you. The jungle, the ruins, the entire world seemed to hold still. The Phyrexian Shade, apex predator, uncatchable legend, wasn't running. It was curious. Jack slowly turned his head, just enough to meet its gaze. And for the first time, the hunter was no longer the prey. The ruins whispered with the breath of ancient winds. Jack stood motionless, every nerve tuned to the unseen force before him. The Phyrexian Shade, legend and terror of Nithros 7, loomed inches away, its presence more felt than seen. It didn't strike. It didn't vanish. It watched. Jack held its gaze, steady but not confrontational. The low, inquisitive chirp it had made moments ago still echoed in his ears. There was no documented evidence of the creature ever making such a sound. No reports of anything other than violent encounters or eerie, predatory silence. Jack had cracked something open. A tremor in the distance snapped the moment. The jungle stirred, heavy boots, plasma charges clicking into place. The others were coming. Jack cursed under his breath. If the Shade sensed a threat, it would disappear, or worse, attack. He had seconds to act. Slowly, he crouched, pressing his palm flat against the earth. He didn't move toward the Shade, didn't reach for it. He simply stayed. The alien beast shifted, its camouflage flickering as its massive frame settled into partial visibility. Jack could see the fine details now, obsidian scales that shimmered like liquid shadow, deep-set eyes filled with something beyond raw instinct. Intelligence. The jungle trembled again. Voices carried through the dense foliage. Spread out. It has to be here. Drakvar's gruff bark sent a wave of irritation through Jack. Sarius' voice followed, sharper. You'll scare it off again, idiot. We need to approach smartly. Too late. The shade tensed, muscles coiling. Its throat vibrated with a deep, warning growl. Jack moved. Not to grab his weapon. Not to run. He lifted his hand, fingers slightly curled, and let out a low, steady whistle. The same sound he had used before. The shade hesitated. Jack whistled again, softer this time, an unspoken reassurance. The predator's body language shifted. The tension remained, but something held it back, something more than fear or calculation. Trust. A rustling to the left. The others were too close. If they came crashing through now, all of this would be wasted. Jack exhaled, then did the most reckless thing yet. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, and turned his back to the shade. A challenge. A gamble. No hunter turned their back on a predator. Not unless they believed it wouldn't strike. Behind him, the shade remained still. Jack stepped forward. 1. 2. 3 paces. Then, a whisper of movement. Not away. With him. Jack didn't dare react. He kept his steps measured, every movement deliberate. The shade was following him. Not stalking. Not circling. Just shadowing. Then the voices broke through the treeline. Drakvar's squad crashed into the clearing, weapons drawn, visors flaring with tracking data. There, one of them barked. Jack turned just in time to see the shade vanish, its body melting seamlessly into the ruins. Drakvar's eyes locked onto Jack. What the hell are you doing? Jack didn't answer. Because something shifted behind him. A ripple. A flicker. Then, the shade reappeared. Not hidden. Not attacking. Just there. The squad froze. Drakvar's jaw slackened. No. That's not. The shade let out a low, guttural chuff, not a growl, but something else. Almost, a greeting. Sarius' ears flicked forward. You, she trailed off, golden eyes narrowing. It's not running from you. Jack exhaled, finally turning to face the creature. No, he murmured. It's not. The squad remained locked in place, hands gripping their weapons. The tension was razor-thin. Drakvar recovered first, stepping forward. Move. I have a clean shot. Jack moved to block him. No. The Drathax warrior scowled. That thing is a mission target. It's not a target. Jack's voice hardened. It's thinking. It's learning. Drakvar let out a harsh laugh. You're insane. The shade shifted its weight, its luminous gaze darting between them. Jack felt its agitation like static in the air. If this escalated, it wouldn't end well for anyone. Sarius' voice cut through the standoff. Jack's right. Drakvar snapped toward her. You're taking a side? She didn't look at him. Her focus remained on the shade, studying it like a puzzle she had just realized had a missing piece. This isn't just an animal, she murmured. It's choosing this day. The moment stretched, balanced on a blade's edge. Then, something Jack never expected. The shade stepped closer. Jack held still, pulse hammering. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't fleeing. It was acknowledging him. Drakvar's grip tightened on his weapon. Jack saw it in slow motion, the subtle shift in stance, the barely perceptible flex of his trigger finger. A second too late, he realized what was about to happen. No. The plasma bolt screamed through the air. But the shade was faster. It moved, not away, but toward Jack. Then, impossibly, Jack felt warmth. Not pain. Not an impact. Just a protective wall of obsidian scales between him and the blast. The shade had shielded him. The world narrowed to a single moment. Then, chaos. The shade let out a roar, not just a sound, but a force that rattled the air, sent leaves spiraling into the sky. Drakvar stumbled back, his squad retreating on instinct. Jack turned, heart pounding. The shade loomed over him, body rigid, eyes burning. And then, the jungle answered. A second roar, distant but distinct, rumbled through the trees. Then another. And another. Sari-Esfer bristled. You idiots, she hissed. You just told the entire jungle where we are. Jack barely heard her. Because the shade wasn't looking at the others anymore. It was looking at him. Not as prey. Not as an enemy. As something else entirely. And Jack knew, with absolute certainty. This hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The jungle pulsed with life. The echoes of the Phyrexian shade's roar still vibrated in Jack's chest as the world around him shifted. The trees whispered with unseen movements, the underbrush quivering with the presence of creatures lurking just beyond sight. Jack could feel the weight of the shade's presence beside him, massive, protective, watching. But this wasn't over. Drakvar recovered quickly, rage twisting his face. He raised his plasma rifle again, his pride too wounded to see the danger. Move, Carter. I'll take it down before it. The shade didn't wait. With an explosion of motion, it leaped, closing the distance before Drakvar could react. Jack barely had time to register the movement before the alien warrior was wrenched off his feet, claws pinning him against a moss-covered pillar. Drakvar gasped, struggling against the force pressing into his chest. His rifle clattered to the ground, useless. The shade loomed over him, breath hot against his face, its black eyes unreadable. Silence. Then, Jack moved. Stop. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. The shade's ears flicked, acknowledging him. It didn't tighten its grip. It didn't strike. It was waiting. Jack took a slow step forward, placing himself between the predator and its prey. His hands remained open, non-threatening. Let him go, he said firmly. The shade's nostrils flared. A test. It was gauging him, searching for weakness. Jack didn't waver. A heartbeat stretched into eternity. Then, impossibly, the shade released Drakvar. The Drathax warrior collapsed, gasping. His squad scrambled to retrieve him, their weapons raised, but no one dared fire. Jack exhaled. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he held his composure. The shade had listened. It had chosen. Sari was the first to break the silence. This isn't possible. Drakvar, still reeling, growled, it's a trick. It's playing with him before it kills us all. Jack turned to the feline cadet. No. It's something else. She studied him, golden eyes narrowing. You're bonded with it. Jack nodded. I think so. Drakvar bared his teeth. So what? You think that makes you special? We came here to capture that thing, not make friends with it. Jack met his glare without flinching. Then tell me, Drathax, how are you planning to capture a creature that has outsmarted every single attempt before now? Drakvar clenched his fists, but he had no answer. Jack didn't wait. He turned back to the shade, studying it closely. It's not just a hunter, he murmured, almost to himself. It's an observer. Sari tilted her head. Meaning? Jack looked at her. It doesn't just survive, it learns. Every encounter, every failed hunt, every time someone tried to capture it and failed. It's been adapting all along. Sari's ears flicked in thought. And you, what, showed it something new? Jack exhaled. I showed it trust. A heavy pause followed. The shade's gaze flicked between them, aware of the weight of the moment. Then, something unexpected. The creature lowered its head, just slightly, but unmistakably. A silent gesture. Submission. Drakvar gaped. "You've got to be kidding me." Jack ignored him. Slowly, he reached out. His fingers brushed against the shade's obsidian scales, warm, smooth, pulsing with barely restrained power. The shade allowed it. Sari inhaled sharply. By the void, he's tamed it. Jack pulled his hand back. He wasn't arrogant enough to believe the bond was unbreakable. This was trust, not control. The shade wasn't his pet. It was his ally. He turned back to the others. "We're not taking it back as a prisoner." Drakvar scowled. "Then what, you just let it walk free?" Jack nodded. "Yes. And we walk with it." Drakvar looked ready to explode, but before he could argue, their comms crackled to life. "Cadets, report." It was Professor Zyrak. His voice was laced with expectation, convinced of their failure. Jack pressed his comm shade sighted. "No casualties." A pause. Then, in its status? Jack met the shade's gaze one last time before answering. "It's coming with me." Epilogue, the legend rewritten. When the cadets returned to the academy, there was no fanfare, no applause, just stunned silence. The Phyrexian shade moved at Jack's side, unchained. Zyrak's expression twisted into something unreadable. "Impossible." Jack smirked. "You keep using that word." Murmurs rippled through the gathered students, whispers of awe and disbelief. Jack ignored them. He reached out, placing a steady hand against the shade's shoulder. It didn't flinch. It didn't flee. It stood with him. Zyrak's voice was clipped. "And what do you intend to do with it, Cadet Carter?" Jack's gaze was unwavering. "What it wants." A long pause. Then, the professor's lips curled. "A fascinating failure of an assignment. You were told to capture it." Jack shrugged. "I did something better." Zyrak exhaled through his nostrils, but there was something new in his gaze, not just disdain. Recognition. "You think this is a victory?" Jack glanced at the shade, then back at Zyrak. "It's proof." The professor's head tilted slightly. "Proof of what?" Jack grinned. "That sometimes, the best way to win, is to stop fighting." The shade let out a low, almost amused chuff beside him. And for the first time in Academy history, humanity had changed the game.